And now Vishy Anand, knight d5, a brilliant move. In this video, Vishy Anand shocks Magnus Carlsen with a brilliant knight jump at the 2024 Global Chess League. Now in the game, Vishy Anand opens 1e4 best by test, and Magnus Carlsen responds 1c5 to Sicilian Defense. Magnus is in a fighting mood this game. Now Vishy knight to f3 and knight c6 for Magnus, and here Vishy Anand goes for the Rossolimo variation with the move 3 bishop b5. Now this line is insanely popular at the highest level for white. The idea is very simple. You're putting pressure on that knight on the c6 square and setting up short castles in the very near future. Now here Magnus Carlsen, he plays literally everything against the Rossolimo Sicilian as black. He even played Pride Ananda's new idea h5 against Ding Liren once, but instead in the game today he goes e6, a very solid line. The main idea is to go knight to e7, then go a6, try to kick back the bishop, and if white takes, then you can recapture on c6 with the other knight, maintaining a very good pawn structure. Now from here, Vishy castles, Magnus goes knight to e7, rook e1 for Vishy Anand, a very good move. The other alternative being d4, but rook e1 very good here as well. The idea is you are giving that bishop on b5 a retreat square on f1 if black goes a6, as Magnus did in the game. Now Magnus here, a6, very solid move, putting the question to the bishop. And now the main line for Vishy Anand is going to be bishop f1, simply retreating the bishop back to the very good square on f1. But instead here, Vishy Anand has a very specific idea in mind for this game against Magnus Carlsen. He starts by taking the knight on the c6 square. Bishop takes c6. Now Magnus takes back with the knight, a very logical move. And now Vishy d4, breaking in the center. What's his idea? Well, after c takes, then knight takes, we have some sort of open Sicilian-style structure. However, both sides have one less knight than usual, and Vishy Anand has very fast development with this rook on e1 eyeing the black king already. So, believe it or not, this position is already very dangerous for Magnus Carlsen. Now Magnus in the game, he goes d6, setting up that Scheveningen-style pawn structure in the middle of the board. And now Vishy knight c3 and Magnus goes bishop d7. So very logical play by both sides. Of course, the idea behind bishop d7 being if white goes knight takes c6, then Magnus can recapture with the bishop on c6, maintaining a good pawn structure and developing the bishop. So very solid play by both sides so far. Now here, Vishy Anand, he shows his big idea for this game. He actually takes the knight on c6. This is not something you want to do unless you have a very specific idea in mind, and Vishy does. Here, Magnus takes back with the bishop, obviously the best move, and here Vishy Anand, knight to d5, jumping in with the knight, an absolutely brilliant move. Now, first of all, this knight on d5 cannot be taken. Both e takes d5 and bishop takes d5 do not work out for black, and I'm going to show all of that. However, beyond that, there is a very big strategic idea behind this move. Here, Vishy is setting up the idea of c4, getting a Maroczy bind in the position. Of course, before this move, with the knight on c3, that pawn is blocked. So now, knight d5, jumping in with the knight, setting up c4 ideas, and the only good idea for Magnus Carlsen is bishop e7, but then you simply take the bishop, getting rid of black's bishop pair, and white's going to have a small but very stable edge in this position. Now, real fast, what happens if you take on d5 with the pawn? That is an absolute disaster. Here, e takes d5 with the double attack on the bishop on c6 and the king on e8 with the rook on the e1 square. So then you got to block the check, bishop e7, then you take back the bishop, and then bishop g5, putting pressure on that pinned bishop on e7. This is an absolute disaster for black. Going back, what about the alternative bishop takes d5? That move is playable, but it's also not that attractive. Here, if Magnus went bishop takes d5, then the move is e takes d5, and white has so much pressure on this pawn on the e6 square. Black is basically forced to go e5, trying to block the pressure, but then Vishy Anand has the resource f4, again piling up on that pinned piece on the e5 square, that being the pawn. So, going back in this position after 11 knight to d5, Magnus Carlsen spots the best idea. You don't want to make this move as black, but there's nothing else. Bishop to e7. Now the problem with this move is it gives up that precious dark squared bishop, and Vishy Anand just jumps in and takes it. Knight takes e7, then queen takes, and finally here Vishy Anand b3, setting up the idea of c4 in the future with that Maroczy bind, and also the idea of bishop to a3, piling up pressure on this weak pawn on the d6 square with the dark squared bishop. So Vishy Anand, very impressive stuff so far in this game. Now Magnus castles, and Vishy goes bishop a3, again piling up on that pawn on d6. Magnus has to defend, rook fd8 played in the game. But now queen d3, followed by the move c4 for Vishy Anand. And again, we're seeing the long-term idea behind that knight jump. Now Vishy has a very strong clamp in the middle of the board with these pawns on the light squares. And here, what is Magnus supposed to do? Well, he starts by getting that last rook into the game, rook ad8. Vishy does the same, rook ad1. Now both sides have pretty much all of their pieces developed. Magnus has to find something to do here to get counterplay. In the game, he goes queen g5, trying to activate the queen. And here Vishy offers a queen trade, queen to g3. Not the most ambitious move, but it is very playable. And now Magnus trades queens, queen takes g3, h takes g3 on the board. And now Magnus, Ben Feingold's favorite move, f6. Of course, Ben Feingold being a big fan of this move right here. Now Vishy does the same, f3, bolstering his pawn chain. And Magnus expands on the king side in his endgame with the move h5. Now the idea behind this move is Magnus is trying to clamp down on a future g4 idea from Vishy Anand, but beyond that, Magnus showing he's ready to play for a win in the endgame against the former world champion. Now Vishy king f2, king f7 for Magnus Carlsen, both sides bringing their kings into the game. And now bishop b4 for Vishy Anand. What's the idea? Well, it's very simple. He actually wants to go bishop to a5, so Vishy bringing this bishop along this route, putting pressure on that rook on the d8 square, a very clever idea. Now here Magnus, he expands in the center with the move e5. This move is very committal. Obviously, the pawn structure in the center is now very, very fixed, and Magnus does have a very big hole on the d5 square. However, beyond that, his king now has access to e6, and overall he's going to be just fine in this kind of position. Now Vishy, bishop a5, putting pressure on that rook. The rook has to move. Rook b8 played in the game, setting up various b6 and a5 ideas in the future. And now rook h1 for Vishy Anand. Very good move, targeting the weak pawn on the h5 square. Of course, that pawn being made weak as Magnus went h5 just a couple moves prior. Now here Magnus, g6 defends the pawn, but then Vishy, g4, expanding on the king side. This is actually a sort of pawn sacrifice. The idea is if Magnus takes the pawn as he did in the game, h takes g4, Vishy, of course, does not recapture the pawn right away. That would destroy his pawn structure, not to mention lose the pawn on the e4 square to the bishop. So instead, he actually jumps right away, rook to h7, hitting the king and skewering the rook behind it. Here's why this is so important. King e6 by Magnus, then Vishy takes the rook, black takes back with the king, and then bishop b4, rerouting the bishop to the b4 square, and there is absolutely no way to defend the pawn on the d6 square. So, king e6, Vishy takes with the rook, rook takes d6, king f7 on the board, and now Vishy, bishop a5, a very good technical move, controlling the d8 square with the bishop and the rook. Now Magnus goes king e7, putting pressure on the rook on the d6 square, bishop b4 on the board, defending the rook, and setting up various discovered attacks like rook takes c6 with checks. So, of course, here Magnus has to move the king, king f7, and Vishy goes back to the a5 square with the bishop. So, Vishy Anand offering a repetition of moves here. If Magnus Carlsen wants the draw, then the draw is king to e7, bishop b4, king f7, bishop a5, and both sides just repeat moves back and forth. But instead here, Magnus, he is playing for a win. He goes for the move g takes f3, trying to break up white's pawn structure on the king side, g takes f3 back, and then rook to h8, activating the rook, setting up rook to h2 ideas. Magnus staying very active in this endgame so far. Now Vishy, bishop d8, targeting the weak f6 pawn, but Magnus f5, expanding and trying to defend. Now rook f6 hits the king and also puts pressure on f5. Vishy may want to go e takes f5, and then after g takes, take with the rook. So Magnus, king g7, then rook d6 from Vishy, king f7, and now e takes, g takes, and rook to f6. Again, the idea, try to target that weak pawn on the f5 square. Now, king g7, and here Vishy, instead of taking on f5, he just repeats with the move rook to d6. He has to do this because the bishop on d8 is actually undefended. If he took the pawn on f5, that would be a massive blunder. That deserves 5 question marks here. Obviously, rook takes d8 wins on the spot. So Vishy going back to the d6 square, rook d6 on the board here. and then Magnus rook h2, activating the rook. Now king g3, rook to e2, supporting his own pawn on e5, and here Magnus setting up various ideas like e4, then e3, trying to push that pawn down the board and promoting to a queen. So here Vishy, bishop g5, a defensive move, getting the bishop back to a much better diagonal here, from where it will have some say in what happens in the game. But then Magnus e4, pushing the pawn down the board. Now f takes and bishop takes, and here Magnus Carlsen has a passed pawn on the king side, but will it be enough to decide the game? Here Vishy Anand, rook d2, trying to get the rooks off the board, and here Magnus obliges. Rook takes d2, then bishop takes, and here we have an opposite colored bishop's endgame. Let's see if Magnus can press for a win or if it's just two draws here. Here in the game, Magnus bishop b1, excellent move, putting pressure on that pawn on the a2 square. Of course, if Vishy goes a3, then the move is bishop a2, and one of these pawns on b3 or c4 is going to fall. So with that in mind, here Vishy, he does not go a3. Instead, he finds a very strong idea. c5, expanding on the queen side. What's the idea? Well, Magnus takes on a2 and then b4. And look at this. These pawns are on dark squares. Magnus has no way of attacking them with the bishop. And of course, Vishy can just move this bishop back and forth forever, always defending the pawn on the b4 square. So with that in mind, it's going to be very hard for Magnus to make progress here. King f6 on the board, then king to f4, bishop b1, bishop e1, and in this position, both sides agreed to a draw, as there is simply no way for Magnus Carlsen to break through on the dark squares, Vishy Anand having that permanent fortress with the king on f4, and the bishop defending the pawns on b4 and c5. Wow, what a game by both players, and especially what a brilliant move by Vishy Anand. 11, knight d5, seemingly giving up the knight, but there were tactical and strategic implications behind it, making it a brilliant move. Now, if you enjoyed this video, go ahead and smash that like button, and let me know in the comment section below what you thought of this move, knight d5 by Vishy Anand, and I'll see you in the next video.